They had been missing for 72 days. When rescuers finally spotted movement in the mountains, no one believed what they were seeing. The helicopter pilot, Marcus Delacroix, had been scanning the same white wasteland for over 2 months. His eyes were trained to catch the smallest anomaly in the endless expanse of snow. A piece of debris, a flash of color, anything that might lead them to the missing rugby team. But on that December morning, as his aircraft carved through the thin mountain air, what he saw through his binoculars made him radio back to base with a voice that trembled. "Control, this is Search 7. I have movement. 2 figures. They're waving." The response crackled through the static. "Confirm, Search 7. Are you certain?" Delacroix adjusted his binoculars, his hands shaking as he focused on the distant shapes against the pristine white. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. 2 skeletal figures, their clothes hanging in tatters, their faces gaunt and hollow, stood in the snow waving frantically at his aircraft. They looked more like ghosts than men, their movements desperate, primal, as if they were waving goodbye to their own humanity. "2 survivors," he whispered into his radio. "Send medical immediately." But even as he spoke those words, Delacroix knew that whatever had walked out of those mountains were not the same young men who had vanished into them. The mountains had kept their secret for 72 days, and now, finally, they were ready to reveal what survival truly costs. The St. Augustine University rugby team had been the pride of their small Catholic college. 22 young men, most barely out of their teenage years, bound together by friendship, faith, and the brutal camaraderie that only comes from bleeding together on the field. They were students, sons, brothers, their whole lives stretching ahead of them like an endless summer. Miguel Santos was their captain, a philosophy major with dark eyes and a quiet intensity that drew people to him like moths to flame. His teammates often joked that he could convince anyone of anything, that he had a way of making the impossible seem inevitable. At 21, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything, never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through sheer force of will. Then there was David Rodriguez, the team's star player and Miguel's closest friend since childhood. Where Miguel was thoughtful and measured, David was pure energy. Always the first to laugh, the last to give up, the one who kept spirits high during their toughest matches. His girlfriend, Carmen, had given him a silver cross before the trip, making him promise to wear it always. He had kissed her goodbye at the airport, telling her he'd be back in time for her birthday celebration. Fernando Gutierrez was the team's medic, a pre-med student whose steady hands and calm demeanor had saved them countless times from serious injuries on the field. His teammates trusted him implicitly, often coming to him with problems that had nothing to do with rugby. He carried a small leather journal where he recorded everything: team statistics, medical observations, personal thoughts. It was his way of making sense of the world. The youngest member of the team was Antonio Vega, barely 18, who had only joined the squad that semester. He looked up to the older players with the desperate admiration of someone trying to prove himself worthy of their respect. His mother had packed his suitcase herself, folding his clothes with the careful precision of someone who might never see her son again. There were others: Carlos the goalkeeper with his nervous laugh, Eduardo the gentle giant who read poetry in his spare time, Raul who could fix anything with his hands and always carried a toolbox in his equipment bag. Each of them had families waiting at home, dreams they were chasing, futures they took for granted. But beneath the surface of their brotherhood, there were tensions that none of them fully understood. Miguel and David had been drifting apart over the past year, their friendship strained by competition and unspoken resentments. Fernando had been struggling with his faith, questioning everything he had been taught about God and suffering. Antonio carried the weight of his family's expectations, the knowledge that he was the first in his family to attend university, that everything depended on his success. These were the fractures that would either bind them together or tear them apart when the mountain tested them in ways they could never have imagined. The charter flight had been arranged by the Rugby Federation, a routine trip to play a match against a rival university on the other side of the Andes. The Fairchild F-227 was an aging aircraft, but the pilot, Captain Roberto Morales, had flown these routes for over 15 years. He knew every peak, every valley, every weather pattern that could make the crossing dangerous. October 13, 1972, dawned gray and cold. The weather reports showed a storm system moving in from the west, but Captain Morales was confident they could beat it to their destination. The team gathered at the small airport, their gear bags slung over their shoulders, their spirits high despite the early hour. Miguel stood at the terminal window, watching the ground crew prepare their aircraft. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The sky had an ominous quality, the kind of heavy gray that seemed to press down on everything. David joined him at the window, slapping his shoulder in that easy way he had. "You look like you're going to your own funeral," David said, but his joke fell flat. Even he seemed subdued. Fernando was checking his medical kit for the third time, making sure he had everything he might need. He had a strange premonition about the flight, a feeling that his skills might be needed for something more serious than the usual bumps and bruises. He tucked his leather journal into his jacket pocket, close to his heart. Antonio sat alone, staring at a letter from his mother. She had written it the night before, filling 3 pages with her careful handwriting, telling him how proud she was, how much she loved him. He folded it carefully and put it in his wallet next to a photo of his family. The boarding call came at 7:30 a.m. The team filed onto the aircraft, their voices echoing in the small cabin as they found their seats. Miguel took his usual spot near the front, David beside him. Fernando sat across the aisle, his medical bag at his feet. Antonio was near the back, still clutching his mother's letter. Captain Morales went through his pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. His co-pilot, a younger man named Diego Fernandez, monitored the radio chatter from the control tower. The weather was deteriorating faster than expected, but they were cleared for takeoff. The Fairchild lifted off at 8:15 a.m., climbing steadily into the gray morning sky. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. The team chatted, played cards, shared stories. Some dozed against the windows. The mountains below looked peaceful, their snow-covered peaks gleaming in the pale sunlight. But as they approached the highest pass, the weather began to change. Clouds rolled in from the west, thick and dark and full of violence. The aircraft began to shudder as it hit the first turbulence, and Captain Morales felt his hands tighten on the controls. "We're going to have to climb," he told his co-pilot. "Try to get above this weather." But the storm was climbing too, reaching up toward them with fingers of wind and ice. The radio crackled with static as they lost contact with the control tower. The aircraft bucked and rolled as the wind caught it, throwing the passengers against their seats. Miguel felt his stomach drop as the plane suddenly lost altitude. Around him, his teammates were gripping their armrests, their faces pale with fear. David was saying something, but Miguel couldn't hear him over the roar of the engines straining against the wind. In the cockpit, Captain Morales was fighting for control. The instruments were spinning wildly, the altimeter needle dancing erratically. He could barely see through the windscreen as snow and clouds swirled around them. The mountains were there, somewhere in the white chaos, reaching up toward them with jagged teeth. Fernando felt the aircraft shudder and knew they were in serious trouble. He began mentally cataloging his medical supplies, preparing for the worst. His journal pressed against his chest, a small comfort in the growing chaos. Antonio was praying, his lips moving silently as he clutched his mother's letter. The words of the Hail Mary ran through his mind like a mantra, the only thing that kept him from complete panic. Then, through the storm, a mountain peak appeared directly ahead of them. Captain Morales saw it at the last second, a wall of rock and ice rising out of the white. He yanked the controls hard to the right, but it was too late. The aircraft clipped the peak with its right wing, sending it into a violent spin. The world exploded into chaos. Metal screamed against rock as the aircraft tumbled down the mountainside, its fuselage breaking apart like a child's toy. The sound was deafening, breaking glass, twisting metal, human screams all mixing together in a symphony of destruction. Miguel felt himself thrown against the ceiling, then the floor, then the ceiling again. Time seemed to slow as he watched his teammates tumble around him like rag dolls. Blood splattered the windows. Equipment bags burst open, spilling their contents throughout the cabin. David's silver cross tore from his neck, spinning through the air before disappearing into the wreckage. Fernando's medical bag split open, its contents scattering like confetti. Antonio's letter fluttered past Miguel's face, the careful words of a mother's love about to be buried in the snow. The aircraft hit the ground with a sound like thunder, sliding down the mountainside in a cloud of snow and debris. The tail section broke away completely, disappearing into a crevasse. The front of the plane crumpled like an accordion, trapping those inside. Then, suddenly, everything was silent. Miguel opened his eyes to find himself buried under a pile of wreckage, his body screaming with pain. Around him he could hear moaning, sobbing, the sound of someone calling for help. Snow was falling through the broken roof of the aircraft, covering everything in white. He tried to move and gasped as pain shot through his ribs. Looking around, he could see other survivors stirring in the wreckage. David was nearby, blood running down his face from a gash on his forehead. Fernando was conscious but trapped under a piece of metal. Antonio was nowhere to be seen. In the days that followed, they would count their losses. 8 of their teammates had died in the crash, their bodies broken and twisted among the wreckage. Captain Morales and his co-pilot were gone, killed instantly when the cockpit crushed against the mountain. The survivors, 14 young men, were left alone in the vast emptiness of the Andes, with no way to call for help and no idea how to survive. But in that first moment after the crash, as the snow continued to fall and the mountain wind howled through the broken aircraft, they still believed rescue was coming. They had no idea that they were about to learn the true meaning of survival, or that the mountain would demand a price that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cold was the first enemy they faced. Even in the broken fuselage, with bodies pressed together for warmth, the temperature plummeted as night fell. The survivors huddled together, sharing what little clothing they had, trying to block the wind that whistled through the gaps in the twisted metal. Miguel had assumed leadership naturally, his voice steady despite the pain in his ribs. "We need to organize ourselves," he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Fernando, what's our medical situation?" Fernando had managed to salvage some supplies from his scattered medical kit. 3 serious injuries, he reported, his voice clinical despite the circumstances. "Carlos has a broken leg, Eduardo has internal bleeding, and Raul might not make it through the night." They found Antonio alive but unconscious in the tail section, his mother's letter still clutched in his hand. When he finally woke, the first thing he asked for was water. There was none to give him. David had fashioned a crude shelter from seat cushions and pieces of the aircraft's interior. "This should help with the wind," he said, but his optimism felt forced. His face was pale from blood loss, and he kept touching the spot where his cross had been. They had discovered a small cache of supplies in the wreckage: 3 bottles of wine, some chocolate bars, and a bag of broken biscuits. Miguel divided them carefully, rationing them to last as long as possible. Each person received a small square of chocolate and a mouthful of wine. It wasn't much, but it was something. The radio had survived the crash, though it was damaged. Carlos, who had studied electronics, managed to get it working sporadically. The static-filled broadcasts they could pick up seemed to come from another world. Weather reports, news updates, music that reminded them of home. They took turns listening, hoping to hear something about a search and rescue operation. For the first 3 days, they heard nothing. Then, on the 4th day, they caught a fragment of a news report that made their blood run cold. The search for the missing rugby team has been called off, the announcer's voice crackled through the static. Weather conditions in the Andes have made it impossible to continue the operation. The families of the victims have been notified. The silence that followed was deafening. Miguel felt something die inside him, a light going out that would never be rekindled. Around him, his teammates stared at the radio as if it had just pronounced their death sentence. David was the first to speak. "They think we're dead," he whispered. "They've given up on us." Fernando closed his eyes and leaned back against the cold metal wall. "We're on our own," he said quietly. "No one is coming for us." Antonio began to cry, quiet sobs that shook his thin frame. The letter from his mother seemed to burn in his pocket, a reminder of everything he would never see again. That night, as the temperature dropped well below freezing, hope died in the wreckage of the aircraft. They had been clinging to the belief that rescue was imminent, that their ordeal would be over soon. Now they faced the terrible truth. They were alone in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with no way to call for help and no hope of being found. The mountain had claimed them, and it would not let them go easily. As the days passed, their situation became increasingly desperate. The small supply of food they had rationed so carefully was gone within a week. The wine helped numb the cold and the pain, but it couldn't fill their empty stomachs. The chocolate and biscuits were nothing more than a memory. Miguel tried to keep morale up by organizing activities. They played cards using a deck that had somehow survived the crash. They told stories about their families, their dreams, their plans for the future. Some of the younger players, like Antonio, spoke about their girlfriends, describing them in such detail that the others could almost see their faces. Fernando had been keeping notes in his journal, recording everything: the weather, their physical condition, their mental state. His handwriting grew shakier as the days passed, but he continued to write, driven by some need to document their experience. "Day 12, he wrote one morning, his fingers stiff with cold. "The hunger is becoming unbearable. Miguel is trying to keep everyone focused, but I can see the desperation in their eyes. David hasn't spoken in 2 days. Antonio keeps talking to his mother's letter as if she can hear him. They tried eating everything they could find. The leather from the aircraft seats was boiled into a bitter soup that made them sick. They chewed on pieces of wood, swallowed snow by the handful, even tried eating their own leather shoes. Nothing helped. The hunger was a living thing inside them, growing stronger each day. Carlos had fashioned crude fishing hooks from pieces of metal, hoping to catch something from the small stream that ran past their makeshift shelter. But the water was frozen solid, and even if it hadn't been, there were no fish at that altitude. Eduardo, the gentle giant who had read poetry to them in their first days of captivity, had grown skeletal. His eyes were sunken deep in his skull, and his clothes hung on him like a scarecrow. He spent most of his time staring at the mountains, muttering verses from Neruda under his breath. "I can feel my body eating itself," he told Fernando one night. "My muscles are disappearing. Soon there will be nothing left." Fernando nodded, understanding the medical reality of their situation. They were in the advanced stages of starvation, their bodies consuming their own tissue to survive. Soon their organs would begin to fail. They had perhaps a week left before they started dying one by one. It was on day 17 that Raúl, who had been clinging to life since the crash, finally succumbed to his injuries. They found him in the morning, his body frozen solid, his eyes staring sightlessly at the gray sky. Miguel knelt beside his teammate's body, his hands shaking as he closed Raúl's eyes. "We need to bury him," he said quietly. But the ground was frozen harder than concrete. They had no tools, no way to dig a grave. Instead, they carried Raúl's body outside and covered it with stones, saying a prayer that felt hollow in the thin mountain air. As they stood around the makeshift grave, the wind howling through the peaks above them, Fernando noticed something that made his blood run cold. The flesh on Raúl's exposed arm had a peculiar quality to it, preserved by the cold, almost as if it were merely sleeping. He said nothing, but the thought lodged in his mind like a splinter. Around him, his teammates were saying goodbye to their friend, but Fernando was thinking about survival, about the biological imperative that overrode everything else. That night, as they huddled together in their shelter, the unthinkable began to take shape in their minds. No one spoke of it directly, but they all knew. The mountain had given them a choice: die with their principles intact, or live by crossing a line that would damn them forever. By day 20, they had found 3 more bodies frozen in the snow, teammates who had been thrown from the aircraft during the crash. The cold had preserved them perfectly, their faces peaceful in death. Miguel stood over them, his own face gaunt and hollow, his eyes reflecting a terrible understanding. "We're going to die here," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "All of us." Fernando looked up from his journal, where he had been writing with a hand that shook uncontrollably. "Unless—" he began, then stopped. "Unless what?" Miguel asked, though he already knew. Fernando couldn't say the word. None of them could. But they all understood. The mountain had given them a choice, and they were running out of time to make it. The human body can survive approximately 40 days without food, though the exact time depends on various factors: body weight, overall health, environmental conditions. The survivors of the crash had now been without proper nutrition for over 3 weeks. Their bodies were consuming themselves, breaking down muscle tissue and organs to fuel their basic functions. Miguel had lost nearly 30 pounds. His cheekbones stood out sharply against his pale skin, and his eyes had taken on a hollow, haunted quality. David was in even worse condition, his body trembling constantly from weakness and cold. Antonio looked like a ghost, his mother's letter now worn thin from constant handling. Fernando continued to document their deterioration in his journal, though his handwriting had become increasingly difficult to read. "Day 23, he wrote. "The hallucinations are getting worse. Eduardo spoke to his dead brother for 2 hours yesterday. Carlos keeps seeing his girlfriend in the snow. I don't know how much longer we can hold on." The hallucinations were a symptom of severe malnutrition, their brains no longer functioning properly. They saw things that weren't there, heard voices calling their names in the wind. Some of them had conversations with family members who existed only in their starving minds. Eduardo had begun reciting poetry constantly, his voice growing weaker each day. "I can feel the mountain inside me," he whispered to Fernando. "It's eating me from the inside out." Carlos had fashioned a crude calendar from pieces of metal, marking each day with a scratch. The marks were beginning to blur together, time losing all meaning in their frozen prison. Day and night blended into one endless gray twilight. David had stopped talking almost entirely, communicating only through gestures and hollow stares. He spent hours examining the spot where his cross had been, his fingers tracing the empty space on his chest as if he could summon it back through sheer will. Antonio had started having conversations with his mother's letter, his voice so quiet that the others couldn't hear what he was saying. Sometimes he would laugh at something only he could hear, and the sound was more frightening than any scream. It was on day 25 that the unthinkable happened. They woke to find Eduardo's body still and cold beside them. Like Raúl before him, he had simply slipped away in the night, his body finally giving up the fight. Miguel knelt beside his teammate's body, his hands shaking as he felt for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. Eduardo's face was peaceful, almost serene, as if death had been a mercy. "We can't bury him," Fernando said quietly. "The ground is still frozen." They carried Eduardo's body outside and placed it beside the others, covering it with stones and ice. But as they stood around the makeshift grave, the same terrible thought occurred to all of them. Fernando was the first to voice it. "The cold is preserving them," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "The bodies, they're not decomposing." Miguel understood immediately. The mountain had given them a choice, and they had finally reached the point where the choice could no longer be avoided. They could die with their humanity intact, or they could live by sacrificing it. "We can't," David whispered, speaking for the first time in days. "We can't do that." But even as he spoke, his eyes were fixed on Eduardo's body, and Miguel could see the terrible hunger in them. They were all staring at their dead teammate, and in that moment, they understood what they had become. The mountain had claimed them, body and soul, and now it was asking for its price. That night, as the wind howled through the peaks and the temperature dropped to levels that should have killed them, they made their choice. There was no formal discussion, no democratic vote. It was simply understood that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Fernando was the one who took the first step. His medical training had taught him about human anatomy, about which parts of the body contained the most nutrition. He approached Eduardo's body with a piece of broken glass, his hands shaking not from cold, but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. "I'm sorry," he whispered to his dead teammate. "I'm so sorry." The others watched in silence as Fernando made the first cut. The sound of the glass against frozen flesh was unlike anything they had ever heard. A wet, tearing sound that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. Some of them turned away, unable to watch. Others stared with the fascination of the damned. Miguel felt something break inside him as he watched Fernando work. This wasn't survival. This was something else entirely. They were crossing a line that would separate them from the rest of humanity forever. They were becoming something that had no name, something that could never be forgiven. David was crying, tears freezing on his cheeks as they fell. "God forgive us," he whispered. "God forgive us all." But Fernando didn't stop. He carved small strips of muscle tissue from Eduardo's body, the meat dark and tough from the cold. He placed them on a piece of metal and attempted to cook them over a small fire. They had managed to start using seat cushions and aviation fuel. The smell was indescribable. Not entirely unpleasant, but wrong in a way that made their stomachs churn even as their bodies screamed for nutrition. Some of them vomited at the smell. Others felt their mouths water despite themselves. Antonio refused to eat, turning away from the small portions that Fernando had prepared. "I can't," he sobbed. "I can't do this." But hunger is a powerful force, stronger than morality, stronger than revulsion. One by one, they took small pieces of the cooked flesh and forced themselves to swallow. The taste was metallic, bitter, but it was protein. It was survival. Miguel chewed slowly, his eyes closed, trying to disconnect his mind from what his body was doing. He thought about his philosophy classes, about the nature of right and wrong, about the choices that define us as human beings. But the mountain had stripped away his humanity, leaving only the animal instinct to survive. Fernando documented everything in his journal, his handwriting shaky but determined. "Day 25, he wrote. "We have become something else. God help us. We have become something else." They ate in silence, the wind howling around them like the voices of the damned. When they were finished, they sat in the darkness, unable to look at each other, unable to speak of what they had done. The mountain had claimed its price, and they had paid it. But the cost was higher than they could have imagined. They had saved their bodies, but they had lost their souls. And this was only the beginning. The psychological impact of their choice was immediate and devastating. That first night after they had crossed the line, none of them slept. They sat in their makeshift shelter, staring at the walls, at the floor, at anything but each other. The sound of the wind seemed different now, more accusatory, as if the mountain itself was judging them. Miguel felt a fundamental change in himself, as if something essential had been torn away. He had always been a leader, someone others looked up to, but now he felt hollow, corrupted. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. David had begun rocking back and forth, his arms wrapped around his knees. "Carmen," he whispered over and over. "Carmen, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Fernando tried to maintain his clinical detachment, treating their situation as a medical emergency that required extreme measures. But his journal entries became increasingly erratic, filled with questions about the nature of humanity and the prices we pay for survival. Antonio had withdrawn completely, refusing to speak or acknowledge the others. He sat in the corner clutching his mother's letter, his eyes vacant and staring. The weight of what they had done seemed to have broken something inside him that could never be repaired. Carlos had begun talking to himself, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Sometimes he would laugh at something only he could hear, and the sound was more disturbing than any scream. The act of consumption had given them temporary relief from their starvation, but it had also opened a door that could never be closed. They had tasted something that was forbidden, and now they craved more. The hunger was still there, perhaps stronger than before, but it was different now. Darker, more primal. Fernando approached the other bodies with increasing clinical efficiency. He developed a system, a process that removed the horror from the act. He would select the best pieces of meat, prepare them carefully, and divide them among the survivors. He told himself it was a medical procedure, a treatment for their starvation. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. The mountains seemed to respond to their choice with increasing violence. The weather grew worse, the wind more fierce, the cold more penetrating. It was as if the peaks themselves were expressing their displeasure with what the survivors had become. Day 30 brought fresh horror. They woke to find Carlos's body frozen beside them, his face twisted in what might have been a scream or a laugh. They had grown used to death, but this one felt different. Carlos had been one of the strongest among them, one of the most determined to survive. If he could die, any of them could. Miguel knelt beside his teammate's body, feeling for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. Carlos's eyes were open, staring at the gray sky with an expression of infinite sadness. Miguel closed them gently, whispering a prayer that felt empty and meaningless. "He's still warm," Fernando observed, his voice clinical and detached. We should take advantage of that." The others stared at him in horror. David began to shake his head violently. "No," he whispered. "No, we can't. Not Carlos. He was our friend." But Fernando was already moving toward the body with his piece of glass. "He's dead," he said simply. "He can't help us anymore except in this way." Miguel wanted to stop him, wanted to preserve some vestige of their humanity, but he knew Fernando was right. Carlos was dead, and they were still alive. The mountain had taught them that survival was the only morality that mattered. They ate Carlos that night, and the horror of it was that it was becoming routine. They had developed a system, a process that removed the human element from the act. They told themselves it was just meat, just protein, just survival. But they all knew they were lying. Antonio had stopped eating entirely, refusing to participate in what he saw as an unforgivable sin. He grew thinner and weaker each day, his body consuming itself. Miguel tried to force him to eat, but Antonio would clamp his mouth shut and turn away. "Let me die," Antonio whispered. "Let me die with my soul intact." But Miguel couldn't let him go. They had lost too many already, and Antonio was the youngest, the most innocent among them. He represented something that Miguel couldn't afford to lose, the memory of who they had been before the mountain claimed them. Fernando had begun conducting what he called examinations of the bodies, determining which parts contained the most nutrition. He spoke in medical terms, using clinical language to distance himself from the horror of what he was doing. But his journal entries revealed the truth. He was slowly going insane. Day 33, he wrote. The protein content of human skeletal muscle is approximately 20%. The liver and kidney are more nutritious but spoil quickly. The brain tissue is rich in fats, but I can't go that far. David had begun seeing his girlfriend Carmen in the snow, having long conversations with her that only he could hear. "She forgives me," he told the others. "She says God understands." She says we're doing what we have to do. But Miguel could see the lie in David's eyes. Carmen wasn't there. She couldn't forgive them because she didn't know what they had become. Nobody did, and perhaps nobody ever would. The mountain had isolated them completely, cutting them off from the world of the living. They existed in a realm between life and death, neither fully human nor completely animal. They had been transformed by their choices, shaped by the cold and the hunger and the terrible things they had done. And still, they survived. Still, they clung to life with a desperation that surprised even themselves. The mountain had tried to break them, but they had found a way to endure. The price had been their humanity, but they had paid it willingly. As the days passed, they began to realize that survival wasn't enough. They needed to escape, to find a way back to the world they had left behind. But first, they would have to survive what the mountain had in store for them next. The avalanche came without warning on day 47, a wall of snow and ice that crashed down from the peaks above with the force of a freight train. The survivors had just enough time to see the white death rushing toward them before it buried their shelter completely. Miguel felt the world turn upside down as the avalanche hit. He was tumbled and thrown, his body battered by chunks of ice and debris. The sound was deafening, a roar that seemed to come from the mountain itself, as if the peaks were screaming in rage. When the snow finally settled, Miguel found himself buried under several feet of heavy, wet snow. He could barely breathe, the weight pressing down on his chest like a giant hand. He fought his way to the surface, gasping and choking, his lungs burning from the cold air. Around him, the landscape had been completely transformed. Their shelter was gone, buried under tons of snow. The bodies they had been preserving were scattered and lost. And most terrifying of all, several of his teammates were nowhere to be seen. "David!" he called out, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Fernando! Antonio!" He heard muffled responses from beneath the snow and began digging frantically with his bare hands. The snow was packed hard like concrete, and his fingers were already numb from the cold. But he kept digging, driven by a desperation that bordered on madness. He found David first, unconscious and barely breathing, his face blue from lack of oxygen. Miguel pulled him to the surface and began CPR, breathing life back into his friend's frozen lungs. David's eyes fluttered open, and he began coughing violently, expelling snow and ice from his respiratory system. Fernando was trapped under a large chunk of ice, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Miguel and David worked together to free him, their hands bleeding from the sharp edges of the ice. Fernando screamed when they moved him, his leg clearly broken in several places, but Antonio was gone. They found his mother's letter, still clutched in his frozen hand, but his body had been swept away by the avalanche. The letter was torn and soggy, the careful words of a mother's love now barely legible. Miguel held the letter in his shaking hands, reading the faded words. "My dear son," it began, "I am so proud of the man you have become. Remember that no matter what happens, you are loved. You are always loved." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Antonio had finally gotten his wish. He had died with his soul intact, refusing to participate in the horror they had all embraced. In death, he had found the peace that had eluded him in life. The avalanche had claimed 3 more of their teammates. They were down to 8 survivors now, and their situation was more desperate than ever. Their shelter was gone, their supplies were buried, and Fernando's injury meant they now had to care for a disabled teammate. Fernando tried to treat his own broken leg using strips of fabric and pieces of wood, but the pain was excruciating. He couldn't walk, could barely move without screaming. Miguel and David had to carry him everywhere, their own weakened bodies struggling under the additional weight. "Leave me," Fernando whispered during one of their rest stops. "I'm slowing you down. I'm going to die anyway." But Miguel refused. Fernando was their medic, their record keeper, their only link to the rational world they had left behind. Without him, They would lose the last vestige of civilization they still possessed. The days following the avalanche were the darkest of their ordeal. They had to dig new shelters in the snow, using their bare hands and pieces of debris from the aircraft. The work was exhausting, their bodies barely able to function from malnutrition and cold. The loss of the preserved bodies meant they had to search for new sources of nutrition. They found 2 of the avalanche victims buried in the snow, their bodies crushed and frozen. The sight was horrific, but their hunger overrode their revulsion. Miguel took charge of the preparation now that Fernando was incapacitated. He had learned the process by watching, though every cut he made felt like he was carving away another piece of his soul. The glass shard felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the gravity of what he was about to do. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the crushed body of his teammate. "I'm so sorry." The others watched in silence as Miguel worked, their faces hollow with hunger and horror. They had all crossed the line now, all participated in the unthinkable. There was no going back, no redemption possible for what they had become. David had begun talking to the mountain itself, carrying on conversations with the peaks as if they were living beings. "Why are you doing this to us?" he would ask the silent stones. "What do you want from us?" But the mountain never answered. It simply continued its slow, methodical destruction of everything human about them. The snow fell constantly now, as if the sky itself was weeping for what they had become. They huddled in their makeshift shelter, sharing body heat and the terrible knowledge of what they had done. The wind howled through the peaks like the voices of the damned, and sometimes they could almost hear their dead teammates calling to them from the white void. Fernando's journal entries became increasingly erratic. "Day 52, he wrote with a hand that shook uncontrollably. "We are no longer human. We are something else, something that the mountain has created. We eat the dead to stay alive, but we are dead inside. The mountain has won." By day 55, they had consumed 4 of their teammates. Each time became easier, more routine, but the psychological cost grew heavier. They stopped saying prayers over the bodies. They stopped apologizing. They simply cut and ate and tried not to think about what they were doing. Miguel had begun having dreams about the mountain eating him, its snow-covered peaks opening like a mouth to swallow him whole. He would wake up screaming, his body covered in cold sweat despite the freezing temperature. David's conversations with Carmen had become more frequent and more disturbing. He would speak to her for hours, describing what they had done, begging for her forgiveness. But the imaginary Carmen was growing more distant, more disapproving. "She's leaving me," David told Miguel one night. "She says she can't love someone who has done what I've done. She says I'm not the same person she fell in love with." Miguel wanted to comfort his friend, but he knew David was right. They weren't the same people anymore. The mountain had changed them, twisted them into something unrecognizable. They were survivors, but they were no longer human. The cold was becoming unbearable. Even with their shared body heat, they were slowly freezing to death. Their fingers and toes had turned black with frostbite. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Their eyes were sunken deep in their skulls, giving them the appearance of walking corpses. Fernando's broken leg had become infected, the wound festering despite their attempts to keep it clean. He was delirious most of the time, mumbling about medical procedures and surgical techniques. Sometimes he would try to operate on himself, cutting into his own flesh with pieces of glass. "I need to amputate," he would say, his voice clinical and detached. "The infection is spreading. I need to cut it off before it reaches my torso." But Miguel wouldn't let him. Fernando was their last link to sanity, their only reminder that they had once been educated, civilized human beings. If he died, they would lose the last vestige of their former selves. It was on day 60 that they realized they couldn't wait any longer. The mountain wasn't going to release them. No rescue was coming. If they wanted to survive, they would have to save themselves. Miguel made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. He would take David and attempt to walk out of the mountains, leaving the others behind. It was a desperate plan, probably suicidal, but it was their only chance. Fernando understood immediately. "You're going to leave us," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Miguel nodded, unable to meet his friend's eyes. "Someone has to try. If we stay here, we'll all die." "Take this," Fernando said, handing him his journal. "If you make it out, people need to know what happened here. They need to know what we became." Miguel took the journal, feeling the weight of their story in his hands. The pages were filled with Fernando's careful observations, his medical notes, his philosophical questions about the nature of humanity. It was a record of their transformation, their fall from grace. David was barely conscious when Miguel told him about the plan. His friend's eyes were glassy and unfocused, his body racked with fever. But he nodded his understanding. "I'll follow you," David whispered. "I'll follow you anywhere." They prepared for the journey by cutting strips of meat from their most recent victim, wrapping them in pieces of cloth to carry with them. The thought of what they were carrying made Miguel's stomach turn, but he knew it was their only hope of survival. The night before they left, Miguel sat with the remaining survivors, looking at their faces in the dim light of their small fire. These were his teammates, his friends, his brothers. But they were also something else now. Fellow monsters, co-conspirators in their own damnation. "If we don't make it," Miguel said quietly, "I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the choices we made, for what we became. I'm sorry for leading you down this path." But there was no forgiveness in their eyes, only understanding. They had all made the same choice, all crossed the same line. They were bound together now by something stronger than friendship, stronger than love. They were bound by shared guilt, shared horror, shared damnation. The mountain had claimed them all, but tomorrow 2 of them would try to escape its grip. They would carry with them the terrible knowledge of what they had done, the weight of their crimes, the memory of their fallen teammates, and if they survived, they would have to find a way to live with what they had become. The morning of their departure was gray and cold, the sky heavy with the promise of more snow. Miguel and David ate a final meal with their surviving teammates, the taste of human flesh now as familiar as their own saliva. They didn't speak of what they were eating. They had long since stopped acknowledging the horror of their diet. Miguel strapped Fernando's journal to his chest, close to his heart. Inside were the names of all their teammates, both living and dead, and the terrible record of their 60 days in hell. If he died on the mountain, at least someone might find the journal and learn the truth. David had fashioned a crude walking stick from a piece of the aircraft's frame. His movements were slow and painful, but he was determined to follow Miguel wherever he led. They had been friends since childhood, and that bond had somehow survived even the mountain's attempts to destroy it. The remaining survivors watched them prepare to leave with a mixture of hope and despair. They knew that Miguel and David were their only chance of rescue, but they also knew that the odds of success were impossibly small. "If you make it," one of them said, "tell our families we died in the crash. Don't tell them what we became." Miguel nodded, understanding the request. The truth would destroy their families, would haunt them forever. It was better to let them believe their sons had died as heroes, not as monsters. "We'll come back for you," Miguel promised, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "We'll find help and come back." But deep down, he knew that if they made it out, they would never return to this place. The mountain had claimed too much of them already. They couldn't risk losing what little humanity they had left. They set out at dawn, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. The silence was deafening after so many days of constant wind and weather. The mountain seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen to its prisoners. Miguel looked back once at their crude shelter, at the dark shapes of their teammates huddled inside. He wondered if he would ever see them again, or if they would become just another part of the mountain's vast cemetery. The first day of their journey was agony. Their bodies, weakened by months of starvation and cold, struggled to carry them across the treacherous terrain. They had to stop frequently to rest, gasping in the thin air, their hearts pounding with the effort. David's condition was particularly worrying. He stumbled frequently, his fever making him delirious. Sometimes he would stop and stare at the snow, talking to people who weren't there. Miguel had to guide him constantly, holding his arm to keep him from wandering off the path. "Carmen," David whispered as they walked. "Carmen, where are you? I can't see you anymore." Miguel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. David was losing his grip on reality, slipping deeper into madness with each step. Miguel wasn't sure if his friend would survive the journey, either physically or mentally. They ate their horrible provisions as they walked, chewing the frozen strips of meat without acknowledgement of what they were. The taste was familiar now, almost comforting in its consistency. They had become efficient predators, consuming their own kind with the casual indifference of sharks. The mountains seemed to react to their escape attempt with increasing violence. The wind picked up, howling through the peaks with renewed fury. Snow began to fall more heavily, obscuring their vision and making each step treacherous. Miguel pressed on, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. He had to escape, had to find help, had to ensure that their story would be told. The mountain had taken everything from them, but it wouldn't take their lives. Not if he could help it. They made camp that night in a shallow cave, huddled together for warmth. David's fever had worsened, and he was talking constantly now, carrying on conversations with his dead teammates, his girlfriend, his mother. Miguel listened to his friend's ravings with growing alarm. "We didn't mean to," David kept saying. "We didn't mean to become monsters. The mountain made us do it. The mountain made us eat them." Miguel wanted to comfort him, to tell him that they had done what they had to do to survive. But he knew the truth was more complicated than that. They had made choices, terrible choices, and they would have to live with the consequences forever. The second day was even harder. David collapsed twice, his body finally giving out under the strain. Miguel had to carry him part of the way, his own weakened body screaming with the effort. They made painfully slow progress, covering only a few miles before exhaustion forced them to stop. David's ravings had become more coherent, more focused. He spoke about the mountain as if it were a living being, a malevolent force that had trapped them deliberately. "It wanted us to become this," he said, his eyes wide with fever and fear. "It wanted us to lose our humanity. It feeds on our degradation." Miguel didn't know if his friend was speaking truth or madness, but the words sent a chill through him. Had the mountain really orchestrated their transformation? Had it trapped them deliberately, forcing them to make the choices that had damned them? They ate their last provisions that night, chewing the frozen meat with mechanical efficiency. Tomorrow they would have to find other food, or they would starve. Miguel tried not to think about what that might mean, what other lines they might have to cross. The third day brought a miracle. As they crested a small ridge, Miguel saw something that made his heart leap with hope. A valley below them, and in that valley, a small structure that looked like a shepherd's hut. "David," he said, shaking his friend's shoulder. "Look, there's a building down there." David opened his eyes, focusing with difficulty on the distant structure. "Is it real?" he whispered. "Or am I hallucinating again?" Miguel stared at the hut, afraid to believe what he was seeing. After so many days of empty wilderness, the sight of human habitation seemed impossible. But it was there, solid and real, with smoke rising from its chimney. They began the descent immediately, their bodies energized by hope for the first time in weeks. The slope was steep and treacherous, but they pressed on, driven by the possibility of rescue. As they got closer, Miguel could see movement near the hut. A figure emerged from the building, a man leading a horse, going about his daily routine with the casual efficiency of someone who had no idea that two ghosts were descending from the mountains. Miguel began to wave frantically, his voice cracking as he called out. The man looked up, shading his eyes against the sun, and Miguel saw the exact moment when he realized what he was seeing. The shepherd, for that's what he was, dropped his horse's reins and stood frozen, staring at the two skeletal figures stumbling down the mountainside. Miguel could only imagine what they looked like. Two walking corpses, their clothes in tatters, their eyes hollow with hunger and horror. "Help us!" Miguel called out, his voice barely audible. "Please help us!" The shepherd ran toward them, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He caught David as he collapsed, his body finally giving out now that rescue was at hand. Miguel sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the realization that they had made it, that they were going to survive. "Who are you?" the shepherd asked, his voice trembling. "Where did you come from?" Miguel looked up at the man, trying to find the words to explain what they had endured. How could he tell this stranger about the mountain, about the choices they had made, about the terrible price of survival? "We're from the rugby team," he said finally. "The plane crash. We've been in the mountains for so long." The shepherd's eyes widened with understanding. "The rugby team from the university? But that was months ago. Everyone said you were dead." "We were," Miguel whispered. "We were dead. The mountain killed us and made us into something else." The shepherd didn't understand, couldn't understand. But he helped them anyway, carrying David into his hut and wrapping them both in warm blankets. He gave them water, real water, and simple food that tasted like salvation. As Miguel sat by the fire, feeling warmth for the first time in months, he thought about the teammates they had left behind. Were they still alive? Were they still human? Or had the mountain claimed them completely? He touched Fernando's journal still strapped to his chest. The weight of their story pressed down on him like a physical force. Soon, he would have to tell people what had happened in the mountains, what they had done to survive. The truth would destroy lives, ruin families, shock the world. But for now he was content to sit by the fire and feel human again, even though he knew it was an illusion. The mountain had changed them forever, marked them as something other than human. They had survived, but they had paid a price that could never be repaid. The shepherd was already preparing to ride to the nearest town, to alert the authorities about the miraculous survivors. Soon, helicopters would be dispatched, reporters would arrive, families would be notified. The world would celebrate their survival, not knowing the terrible truth of what survival had cost. Miguel closed his eyes and tried to remember who he had been before the mountain claimed him. But that person was gone, lost in the snow and ice and the terrible choices they had made. What remained was something else. A survivor, a monster, a walking reminder of what humans could become when pushed beyond their limits. The mountain had released them, but it would never let them go. They would carry its mark forever, the knowledge of what they had done, the taste of human flesh, the weight of their crimes. They had escaped the mountain, but they would never escape themselves. And somewhere in the peaks above, their teammates waited for rescue that might never come, slowly transforming into something that had no name, something that the mountain had created from their desperation and hunger. The shepherd returned within hours, bringing with him a rescue team and medical personnel. Miguel watched from the window as helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating against the mountain air like mechanical vultures. The outside world had found them at last, but Miguel wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The medical team was shocked by their condition. Miguel and David were barely alive, their bodies ravaged by months of starvation and cold. Their weight had dropped to dangerous levels. Their organs were failing. Their minds were clearly traumatized by whatever they had endured. "We need to get them to a hospital immediately," the head medic said, his voice urgent. "I don't understand how they survived this long." Miguel wanted to laugh at the irony. They had survived by becoming something that wasn't quite human, by making choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had survived by eating their friends, by crossing lines that should never be crossed. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, Miguel managed to grab one of the rescue workers by the arm. "There are others," he whispered. "In the mountains. You have to go back for them." The rescue worker nodded, not understanding the urgency in Miguel's voice. He didn't know that every hour of delay meant another step deeper into damnation for those left behind. He didn't know that the mountain was still feeding on them, still transforming them into something inhuman. The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur of medical equipment and concerned voices. Miguel drifted in and out of consciousness, his body finally allowing itself to shut down now that safety had been reached. But even in his delirium, he could feel the weight of Fernando's journal against his chest, the terrible record of their transformation. David was in even worse condition, his body shutting down from the stress of their ordeal. He was unconscious, muttering incoherently about Carmen and forgiveness and the mountain that had claimed his soul. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize him, but Miguel could see the doubt in their eyes. At the hospital, they were immediately isolated, their condition so severe that the doctors weren't sure they would survive the night. Miguel was connected to machines that monitored his vital signs, fed through tubes that delivered nutrition directly to his bloodstream. His body was so emaciated that he looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin. The world outside was already beginning to react to news of their survival. Reporters gathered outside the hospital. Families wept with joy at the news that their sons might still be alive. The story was spreading across the globe. The miraculous survival of 2 rugby players who had been given up for dead. But Miguel knew that the real story was much darker than anyone imagined. The journal pressed against his chest felt heavier with each passing hour, weighted with the truth of what they had become. Soon he would have to decide what to tell the world. How much of the truth could be revealed without destroying everything? A priest came to visit them, offering comfort and prayers of thanksgiving for their miraculous survival. Miguel listened to the holy words with a mixture of longing and revulsion. How could he accept absolution when he had committed the ultimate sin? How could he be forgiven for what he had done to survive? "God watched over you," the priest said, his voice warm with conviction. "He protected you in the wilderness and brought you home safely." Miguel wanted to tell him the truth, that God had abandoned them in the mountains, that they had survived by becoming something that God would never recognize. But he remained silent, unable to speak the words that would shatter the priest's faith. David's condition worsened during the night. His fever spiked, and he began having violent hallucinations. He screamed about the mountain, about the bodies in the snow, about the taste of human flesh. The medical staff attributed his ravings to delirium, but Miguel knew better. David was reliving their transformation, trapped in an endless loop of horror and guilt. "We ate them," David screamed, his eyes wide with terror. "We ate our friends. We cut them up and ate them like animals." The doctors sedated him, but Miguel could see the questions in their eyes. What had these young men endured that could produce such disturbing hallucinations? What had they done to survive in the mountains? Meanwhile, the rescue operation for the remaining survivors was being organized. Helicopters were being dispatched to the crash site, equipped with medical personnel and supplies. The world watched with hope and anticipation, believing that they were about to witness another miracle. But Miguel knew the truth would be far more complicated than anyone imagined. The teammates they had left behind had been pushed even further into darkness, forced to continue their transformation without the anchor of hope that had driven Miguel and David to escape. By now, they would be barely recognizable as human beings. Miguel tried to prepare himself for the moment when the rescue team would return, when they would have to face the truth of what their friends had become. The world would demand answers, explanations, accountability. But how could he explain the choices they had made? How could he make people understand that sometimes survival comes at a price too high to pay? The journal against his chest felt like a burning coal, its pages filled with the careful documentation of their fall from grace. Fernando had recorded everything: their physical deterioration, their psychological breakdown, their gradual transformation into something inhuman. It was a testament to their damnation, a record of the mountain's victory over their humanity. As the hours passed, Miguel began to understand that their survival was only the beginning of their ordeal. The mountain had released them, but it had marked them forever. They would have to live with what they had done, carry the weight of their crimes, face the horror in the eyes of those who learned the truth. They had escaped the mountain, but they would never escape themselves. They were survivors, but they were also monsters, and the world would have to decide which of those truths was more important. The helicopter carrying the rescue team returned at dawn, and Miguel could tell from the somber expressions of the medical personnel that they had found something that defied easy explanation. The survivors they brought back were barely recognizable as human beings. Skeletal figures with hollow eyes and haunted expressions, their bodies ravaged by months of unspeakable survival. Fernando was among them, his broken leg now completely useless, his journal-writing hand frozen into a claw. He was carried on a stretcher, his eyes vacant and staring, his lips moving in silent conversation with people who weren't there. When he saw Miguel, he smiled with an expression that was more terrifying than any scream. "You came back," Fernando whispered, his voice barely audible. "You kept your promise." But Miguel hadn't come back. He had escaped and left them to face the mountain alone, to continue their transformation without hope of rescue. The guilt of abandonment was added to the weight of his other crimes, another stone in the crushing burden he would carry forever. The other survivors were in even worse condition. They moved like ghosts, their eyes reflecting depths of horror that couldn't be fathomed. They had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, forced to make choices that had stripped away every vestige of their former selves. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize them, but Miguel could see the questions in their eyes. What had these young men endured? What had they done to survive for so long in such hostile conditions? The answers would come eventually, but not yet. For now, the world would celebrate their miraculous survival, not knowing the terrible price they had paid. As the days passed, fragments of the truth began to emerge. The survivors spoke in whispers, their voices filled with shame and horror. They told stories that the doctors attributed to trauma-induced hallucinations, but Miguel knew they were remembering the truth of what they had become. The families of the dead demanded answers. Where were their sons? What had happened to them? The survivors' stories were inconsistent, fragmented, filled with gaps that suggested something too terrible to be spoken aloud. Miguel found himself at the center of the storm, the de facto spokesman for the group. He had to find a way to tell the story that would satisfy the world's curiosity without revealing the full extent of their transformation. It was a delicate balance, a dance between truth and merciful deception. He began to craft the narrative that would become the official version of events. They had survived by eating the leather from the aircraft seats, by melting snow for water, by huddling together for warmth. They had been forced to make difficult decisions, but they had maintained their humanity throughout their ordeal. It was a lie, but it was a necessary lie. The truth would destroy too many lives, would shatter too many families, would rock the foundations of faith and civilization. Sometimes mercy was more important than honesty, but the weight of the deception was crushing. Every interview, every retelling of their sanitized story, added another layer to the burden Miguel carried. He was not just a survivor. He was a guardian of secrets, a keeper of truths too terrible to be spoken. Fernando's journal remained hidden, its pages filled with the real story of their transformation. Miguel had read it during his recovery, reliving every moment of their descent into darkness. The clinical observations, the philosophical questions, the gradual acceptance of their new reality. It was all there, documented with scientific precision. The journal was evidence of their crimes, but it was also a testament to their humanity. Fernando had continued to write even as he transformed, maintaining his role as observer and recorder even as he participated in the unspeakable. It was a remarkable document, a window into the human soul under extreme duress. But it could never be published, never be shared with the world. The truth it contained would destroy lives, ruin families, shake the foundations of society. It had to remain hidden, locked away like a dangerous secret. Miguel made his decision on a gray afternoon, 3 weeks after their rescue. He would carry the truth alone, bear the weight of their crimes without sharing the burden. The world would never know what they had really done to survive, what they had really become in the mountains. He visited each of his surviving teammates, speaking to them in whispers, ensuring that they understood the importance of maintaining their shared deception. Some of them were too broken to understand, lost in their own private hells of guilt and trauma. Others nodded with the grim understanding of co-conspirators. "We tell them we ate leather," Miguel said quietly. "We tell them we melted snow. We tell them we prayed and hoped and waited for rescue. We never speak of the other things." They agreed, bound together by their shared secret, their mutual complicity in the lie that would protect the world from the truth. They had survived the mountain, but they would never survive the revelation of what survival had cost them. The official inquiry concluded that the survivors had endured extraordinary hardship but had maintained their humanity throughout their ordeal. They were heroes, symbols of the human spirit's ability to endure against impossible odds. The world celebrated their survival, never knowing the terrible price they had paid. Miguel returned to his studies, but the words on the page seemed meaningless now. Philosophy had failed him when he needed it most, providing no guidance for the choices he had been forced to make. He had learned truths about human nature that no textbook could teach, lessons that could never be shared. David struggled with his recovery, his mind fractured by the weight of what he had done. He would wake up screaming in the night, reliving the moment when he had first crossed the line from human to something else. Carmen had visited him once, but she could see the change in him, the darkness that had settled behind his eyes. She left quietly, and he never saw her again. Fernando never fully recovered from his injuries, but he continued to write, filling new journals with observations about trauma and survival. His work became increasingly abstract, philosophical, as if he were trying to understand the nature of humanity itself. But he never wrote about the mountains, never documented the truth of what they had experienced. The other survivors scattered to the winds, each carrying their own burden of guilt and memory. Some disappeared entirely, unable to face the world that celebrated their survival. Others struggled to rebuild their lives, haunted by dreams of snow and cold and the taste of human flesh. Miguel became the keeper of their story, the guardian of their secret. He married eventually, had children, built a life that looked normal from the outside. But he never forgot what he had learned in the mountains, never stopped carrying the weight of their crimes. In his private moments, he would take out Fernando's journal and read the careful observations of their transformation. The clinical language couldn't mask the horror of what they had become, the lines they had crossed, the humanity they had sacrificed for survival. Day 25, he would read. "We have become something else. God help us. We have become something else." The words never lost their power to wound, never stopped reminding him of the choice they had made and the price they had paid. They had survived the mountain, but they had lost themselves in the process. They had escaped death, but they had embraced damnation. Years passed, and the world moved on. The story of the miraculous survivors became legend, a tale of human endurance and divine providence. Books were written, movies were made, all celebrating the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. But Miguel knew the truth that could never be told. They had not triumphed over anything. They had been broken by the mountain, transformed into something that no longer deserved to be called human. They had survived, but survival had cost them everything that made life worth living. The mountain had won in the end. It had claimed their souls, even as it released their bodies. They had walked out of the snow and ice, but they had left their humanity behind, buried forever in the frozen wasteland where they had learned the true meaning of survival. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Miguel could still hear the mountain calling to him, reminding him of what he had become, what he had done, what he would always carry with him. The peaks were there, in his memory, waiting for him to return to claim what was left of his soul. They had vanished into the snow as young men full of hope and dreams. But to survive, they had crossed a line that left part of them behind forever. The mountain had released them, but it would never let them go. They were survivors, but they were also ghosts, walking reminders of the price that must sometimes be paid for the privilege of drawing breath. The truth would die with them, buried as deeply as the bones they had left in the snow. The world would never know what they had really endured, what they had really become, what they had really sacrificed for the chance to see another sunrise. But they would know. They would carry the weight of their crimes until the day they died, haunted by the memory of what they had done to survive. The mountain had marked them forever, branded them as something other than human, something that had no name and no place in the world of the living. They had escaped the mountain, but they had never escaped themselves. And in the end, that was the cruelest joke of all, to survive only to discover that the price of survival was everything that made survival worthwhile. The mountain had claimed them, body and soul, and they would never be free.